Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. What I have learned in some 45, 50 years of experience in talking to an audience like this, that it is better to be very careful in what I say and not to pretend that I know answers, talking to an audience that knows much more about what I will be talking about than I do. So you should realize that I speak only from inadequate knowledge, but I will risk some positive statements in any event. It's been a very instructive 3 days for me. My knowledge of Juarez is limited to 3 days of fairly intensive contact and looking at the city. I've been impressed, I think, among other things, at how difficult the problem is here. And difficult, historically difficult, immediately difficult, partly for natural reasons. That is, the fact that the Rio Grande is dry is not an advantage. Juarez was here, as I gather it from various monuments and placards. Juarez is here because of the Rio Grande, when it had water, and it now has no water. So that it needs to find a different basis for continuing to exist and for growing, and that creates fairly significant problems. And it faces a number of political problems, some of which are Mexican problems, many of which are problems that stem from the United States. I cannot pretend that the United States' contribution to Juarez's growth and prosperity has been entirely a positive one and a fair one. So that the natural and the political problems come together, they relate to each other, and they cause serious problems. The fact that in general there is a movement on the political front towards neoliberalism in the United States and in much of the overdeveloped world increases the problems. The problem of climate change is one that is not immediately under your or our control and creates major problems in the future. So there's a lot to be done. And what I want to limit my comments to is what Planners Network could do about it, or what the perspective of a group like this might be in dealing with the problems that the city faces. And I will try to organize what I say with 3 points. I think Planners Network can help to contribute a political analysis to the solution of the problems that I've mentioned. I think it might help to contribute a political vision for the future. A vision somewhat different from the conventional, and I want to end with a comment on that. And I think it might help to contribute a political strategy. Again, this is an area you know more about, many of you, than I do, and it would be very ripe for discussion after we're over. I'll try to leave time for that discussion. But to start with the political analysis, what's the problem? The problem, it seems to me, is fairly clear here. It's a problem that involves low wages, that involves poverty, that involves poor housing, that involves economic insecurity, problems of infrastructure, problems of inequality. And whenever In the last 3 days, I've heard people from official circles in particular talk about the problems and what can be done. The problem of corruption is prominently mentioned. It's not a problem that I have any particular competence on, but it seems to me worthwhile making the point that the problem of corruption is not one limited to Juarez, but is a fairly serious problem for the United States also. The corruption of public officials that people speak of or have spoken of in Juarez is, I think, at least matched by the corruption, the moral corruption, I would call it, of the members of the Congress of the United States right now, and of many of the political leaders of our country. I think it is a corruption that is as inexcusable as the corruption is here, and as difficult to eradicate as I gather the corruption has been here. One speaks or has spoken about the role that gangs have played in contributing to that corruption. I think that has some parallel in the United States also. That one speaks of the violence that gangs are prone to here. I think one might put it in the perspective of the violence that the United States Border Patrol inflicts on residents and citizens of Mexico. These are not things that are unique to Mexico or to Juarez. They are common to both of our countries, and I think they need to be dealt with in both cases. The problems are also relevant to both countries in terms of the economy of Juarez. I have only been learning in detail about it fairly recently. The wage structure here is one of the advantages for the location of industry here. The best estimate I can find is that the average wage is some 1/10 of the average wage for comparable work in the United States. And it seems to me that that is a problem not only for those that are too poorly paid, but also in terms of the inequality that it represents, and the problem of living in a society with that much of a difference between rich and poor. The analysis that I'm about to give, I spoke on Wednesday about this also, and I just want to summarize it now. It certainly needs discussion, but let me simply state my own analysis of what's going on. It seems to me that the existence of the border is a major factor in producing the problems that need to be dealt with. It is a border that is legitimated by the existence of the Rio Grande and the conception that the Rio Grande is a natural border. It's not. It may have been a boundary. There is a difference between a boundary and a border. A border is something man-made. It's a line drawn on a map. And it's drawn on a map by those who hold power, and it's imposed by them on the map for their benefit. It is not a natural division among people. It is very much an instrument of inequality and domination and exploitation in an economic sense here. A boundary, and particularly a river as a boundary, is historically always a unifying factor. One speaks of valleys as places run through which a river runs, but in which people on the two sides of the river have essentially parallel and mutually supportive occupations and interests. And it's true within cities as well as in the countryside. Major cities in the world have rivers that run right through them. The Seine in Paris runs through the middle of the city. The Thames in London runs through the middle of the city. The Danube in Budapest runs through the middle of the city. A boundary is a seam rather than a division, a place of coming together and working jointly, so that there is no natural argument for the location of a border here. On the contrary, the border needs a justification itself. It serves, it seems to me, to worsen, if not cause, the set of problems that I mentioned at the beginning, the poverty, the low wages, and so forth, by playing on the difficulty of crossing the border, the exclusiveness that the border makes possible, the controls that the militarization of the border makes possible. These are all reinforcements of the inequality that the border reflects and reinforces. And there are non-spatial borders that run through the two sides, Juarez, El Paso, Mexico, United States. There are what I would call non-spatial borders. That is, Mexico is not homogeneous, and the United States is not homogeneous. There are divisions within each, and conflicts within each. And there is an exercise of power within each, and there are some that are more powerful and others that are less powerful in each country. And the conflicts among them, I think, need to be recognized and faced and feed directly into the use of the border. If our internal borders were differently laid, I think our international borders would also be differently laid. We had a talk on graffiti last night. My favorite graffiti is one that was written on the Berlin Wall after unification and the point at which there was a great deal of discussion of the past consequences of the wall. And the graffiti says, walls do not exist between peoples, walls exist between above and below. And it seems that's a very nice image, a very useful image of the reality that we live in. So this is the political analysis. I'm not sure that the Planners Network has ever voted on an analysis, but it's at least what I've come to conclude, and what I think is in general consistent with the history of the Planners Network's analysis of urban political and economic issues. And I'll leave it at that for now in terms of the analysis. In terms of the political vision, I think possibilities that I have seen or heard since coming here as to the future of Juarez have been narrow. I have seen maps of what is planned for, where the transportation patterns might be, where the investment might be. And they are maps that show the borders of Juarez and stop at the international border. And it seems to me of the essence of the economy of Juarez that it is related to what happens in El Paso and north of the border. And that one needs to look at both sides of the border at once if one is doing any serious planning for the welfare of people on this side or on the other side of that border. And it seems to me Planners Network might play a role in developing that vision. I have a suggestion for how that might be done, but as an objective, it seems to me a good one. The fact that Planners Network is not yet perhaps, a Mexican organization means that you have available to you a view from the outside, a view that is less informed than you are, but that is at least fresh, 3 days fresh. And that may be useful. And the idea of seeing Juarez as part of a metropolitan region, I have heard spoken about every now and then in panels at this conference, but I've not seen anything that gets very concrete on what that means. And it seems to me that the idea of developing a vision for the area is one that is well worth pursuing and that Planners Network might help on. Specifically, the vision of the absence of the border is one that is worth at least thinking about. And as I say, I'll want to make a proposal along those lines in a few minutes. But there is a long history in planning that it presents utopian visions as well as transportation plans, and that those utopian visions have a political role as well as a technical role in suggesting the direction in which planning might go. And I think the idea of developing a utopian vision for Juarez and its region is a contribution that Planners Network could encourage or cooperate in developing. That it might simply be an area, what would it look like if there were no borders at all? How would one cross over what is a boundary, what is an area of difference, but it's a fairly dry boundary from what I've seen, and it shouldn't pose any major problems. So that I think pursuing that idea and using the development of a, if you want, a utopian vision for the area, and doing it jointly between people on both sides of the border, planners on both sides of the borders, might be a contribution that Planners Network could make. And thirdly, the development of a political strategy, because I think everyone that thinks about it, I'm sure everyone here realizes that planning is a very political process, and that it's not enough to draw nice pictures on paper. If you want to get anything done, you need to have the political support and the political power get it done or to influence its doing. And I think Planners Network can think through a strategy and at least get it spoken about, get it thought about as a political matter, and more generally than I have seen thus far from the panels that I've been at that have dealt with the future of the city. And the specific weakness, I say with apologies because I know a good bit of work has gone into them and there's very competent planning going on in Juarez. But what I miss is the politics of the process as something being dealt with. And I say this because I've been spending some time looking at the language that planners use, and the language that citizens use, and that government officials use. And the word that strikes me as more and more problematic is the word we, W-E. The assumption is that we are all in this together, and that we need to do this and that and the other thing, and we all have the same interest in finding the right thing to do. And I think this is simply a misreading of reality, a non-political reading of reality. And I think there are divisions among us, that there are various definitions of who we are. And I think they need to be put on the table. I don't think that a vision that hopes to be the same vision for everyone is going to get very far. And perhaps the experience of Planners Network and its members can help to clarify those lines of division. There are borders, and there is not only the international border, there is, if you want to consider the international border a horizontal border, there are vertical borders within both countries, borders between conflicting interests and conflicting groups and conflicting desires, and to some extent, but much less, I think, conflicting cultures that need to be dealt with if anything is to be accomplished. And I think Planners Network can help in developing that analysis. And that's that political strategy. And let me end with some details on what that strategy might look like and what the role of the Planners Network might look like. I do this with some trepidation because what I want to do is suggest some, I think I'm up to 8 tasks for Planners Network, which far exceed what Planners Network can reasonably be asked even to contemplate, but which it seems to me ought to be our perspective. And I'm going to end with 2 very concrete ones that I think we can accomplish. But the first 7 of them are more a perspective of issues that Planners Network ought to be aware of and thinking about in what it does. The first task seems to me to clean our own house. Our own house defined as, for those that are in planning in a professional capacity or in an advocacy capacity, working with others and working with organizations that are dedicated to planning. Cleaning our own house means looking at who our own members are, dealing with the composition of the planning profession. It is historically has been in the United States a matter of concern that there are fewer members of minority groups, particularly African Americans historically, and particularly women in the profession than there are in the society at large, or that are needed to be. It seems to me that the small number of planners that speak Spanish in the United States is a problem that ought to concern the profession. Hispanic, Spanish-speaking people do now already, or may very shortly be, the largest single minority in the United States. And certainly issues concerning the role and position of non-English speaking is a major issue that planning needs to deal with, and does deal with very inadequately in the United States. I've read that there is also concern in Mexico, or in Juarez, that one of the planks in the strategic plan for Juarez is to promote English speaking. You know much more about that problem than I do. But clearly there's a long way to go before we are on an equal communicative basis between the two of us, the two of our groups. And that is a matter that Planners Network within the planning community should be dealing with. We should be dealing with cooperative work across the border. And there is very little, I think, of that going on, at least in conventional planning terms. We heard some about Tijuana and California, joint efforts, but very little. Okay, so, and the discussion that, I don't know to what extent it's been on the table, but I know it's been discussed at various points in the conference. Forming a chapter of Planners Network in Juarez would be a wonderful thing, I think, and would be a great contribution not only to planning in Juarez, but also to planning in El Paso, and to the whole approach to international and global planning issues in the United States as well as in Mexico. I hope that that does move forward. So that's the task. That's the first task: cleaning our own house, working among planners to see that planners do more and do better. The second is to the contribution we might make is to deepen the analysis that I gave at the very beginning of this talk, and which I'm really not qualified to make yet, but to qualify us to make it, and to see whether what I said makes sense, or what alternate information is needed. We've had discussions amongst ourselves in some of the field trips as to exactly how the economics of Juarez and El Paso work, and how they relate to each other, why there is a market that apparently appeals to customers in Juarez on the other side of the border instead of on this side of the border. Things that we are simply, when I say we, I mean, I have this from something I read 20 years ago. When I say we, I mean me and my friends. There is a lot of information that we need, and that needs to be developed. There is a huge amount of research that I think can be done if one is looking at it from the point of view of what information is useful if we question the border. It's quite different from what information you need if you accept the border and are trying to figure out how to live with it. It's a different set of questions, and it's the questions that it seems to me the network can help to raise and to do on both sides of the border. The issues of transnational planning that we've spoken about in panels here is something that also Planners Network is already doing some work on, and much more work needs to be done on. There are local planning implications in the United States, where most Planners Network members at this point live and work. There are planning implications of borders and of immigration policies and of the relationship between ethnic groups and cultural groups and language groups and new residents and old residents that can use a great deal of research. The question of how much mixing and to what extent and solidarity among new groups is promoted and should be encouraged, particularly among new arrivals, immigrants, and to what extent assimilation should be encouraged. These are all questions that are partly value questions, partly political questions, and partly serious questions of information and evaluation of existing experience that the network could do and promote research on. The third area, the third task that Planners Network might undertake is the clarification of, in a sense, of who the bigger we is and what the divisions among them are. We speak now, everybody speaks now, of the 1% and the 99%. The 1% being the above and the 99% being the below. It's a formulation that comes out of the Occupy movement in the US. And in order to achieve effective political change, we need the support. The 99% have to move into action. It will be their power, it is certainly not the power of the planning profession that will produce change. There is a little bit of an unconscious, perhaps, formulation that we use sometimes when we say we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to end corruption, we need to make the border permeable, whatever. There's the implication that if we only had the information and put it on the table, that would be the solution to the problem. That really we need research and that's it. Once we have the data, we simply have to present it to those in power and they will benevolently implement what its implications are. I think that's, I think it's not only wrong, I think it's mischievous, I think it's misleading. It makes the objective of planning simply gathering information and passing it on. And I think planning has to be much more active than that. Has to take positions, has to draw conclusions. But it has to have the information available, it has to have the backup that will permit it to defend its position. The analysis of the 99% in particular, I think, needs to be an analysis of what the division of interests is. Because because the 99% are not all alike. That's not a homogeneous 99%. There are lines of division there also. It's not only what kind of work people do, whether people are men or women, whether they're elderly, whether they work in a big city or a little city, whether they work on this side of the border or that side of the border. There are all kinds of divisions among the majority. And in order to address the problems that I've talked about, we need to be clear on who's on which side. And coalitions need to be formed and need to be organized. And Planners Network can help in that. The line between planning and organizing is a very thin line. And it's come out in a number of the panels here, that planning is, to a very large extent, also organizing. Getting information, but getting the information to people. And helping them understand what to do about it. So the third task, it seems to me, is research in the political analysis of who's on which side, with whom coalitions may be made, what plans can be formulated that will move in the direction that we want to go. The fourth task is then to use that information to organize. And that means, at the very least, to go public, to make the information that we gather and our conclusion and our position on the information, the values that we see involved, to make that public, to get it out in the media, to get it to the groups themselves that are concerned, so that they know what they can and can't do, and with whom they can and can't work, and who to watch out for, and not to watch out for, and how far their friends will go with them and where they will stop. And one indication of how big that task is the chart that Peter showed in his table, where he looked at what groups, institutions dealing transnationally with the border are concerned about. And in the listing, economic development is way up there, security is there, and environment is a good bit further down. And he's got it quantified, having counted questionnaire answers. And at the bottom is urban, and that's got a 0. That is, there is no, I gather from that data, there is no sense among the international institutions, perhaps the International Water Commission, for instance, that we heard from, there is no attention being paid to the urban implications of international activities and transborder activities. And that should stop. We should be able, we should be
The mic stopped working. The mic stopped working.
The mic.
Yeah. You have more batteries than the microphone.
Yes, you've outlasted the microphone. Like, move the mic.
Maybe you didn't like what I'm talking about.
We're back. We're back.
Okay, thank you. I was saying we need to put urban back on the agenda of international institutions that are working in this area, and the media is one way of doing that. It may be, we have some leeway professionally also to to make a political difference. To the extent that we play a role in formulating public policy, and I don't know what that looks like in Juarez or in Mexico. I do know what it looks like in the United States. Our role as professionals in influencing policy is trivial, is tiny. The people that we work for, the government leaders that we work for, want our information and they'll decide what to do with it. And if we're lucky, we'll give them alternatives and they'll choose among them. And if we do it right, we'll make the alternatives we like look better than the alternatives we don't like. But that's about as much power as we have. And I think we can do better than that, because in the end they will use our information and they will rely on us to legitimate what they're doing. And I think we need to be clear on what we're not doing and what our proposals do not accomplish, what the next step is. We talk about it, I talk about it, as transformative planning. It's a conception that we should, for any single proposal that we make, we should look at what it does accomplish and what more needs to be accomplished. It needs to look at whether it goes in the direction of the utopian vision that I mentioned and that I think we should adopt. So that as professionals in preparing proposals, I think we can make some difference. There are opportunities for expert testimony sometimes. Again, I don't know the strategic situation here well enough, but I think it might be that an organization as going to say as intelligent enough as Planners Network. That's not quite the right word, but as good enough as Planners Network might attract an audience. It might get some attention in the press. I know that Tom and some others have been talking about a statement that might issue from the conference on various of the issues that we've discussed. It may be that a statement coming from a group like Planners Network, particularly if it's a joint statement that's been developed on both sides of the border, might have some influence. I think there is a task to be done in terms of our professional work, making our work transformative and not simply narrow problem solving. The other two proposals I want to make are more concrete. And one of them is probably more relevant for academics or volunteers than general. And that is the idea of a joint studio, a practicum, that would have planners sit down together and develop a plan for the future of Juarez if there were no border. It should build on and ignore existing planning, because the existing planning assumes the border. And I would simply take that out and see what you would end up with. And I think that's a challenge. It's not a simple thing. I must say, when we crossed the border and I saw the bed of the Rio Grande, it occurred to me, if that wasn't a border, wouldn't that be a wonderful place for a housing development in the riverbed? Who knows? It would certainly have high accessibility on both sides. But there are many possibilities that could be explored. One might even take the idea that is already talked about in the strategic plan, but with not much detail, the idea of looking at the region as either a metropolitan region or even beyond that. The language there is a binational metropolitan planning exercise. I think we could play with the idea of how that might work. The idea of looking at the relationship between the border zone and the area behind it on both sides, looking at it really as a regional and not only a metropolitan area, is something that very concretely planners could think about and develop and draw pictures of, draw maps of, calculate costs. Would be interesting, for instance, to calculate the cost saving of not having a border. Would be pretty big. If we took the military budget and the National Security Administration budget that was developed, that is spent on policing the border, creating the border, building the border, and spent that instead on promoting solidarity between the two sides, we could do an awful lot. And those look like very expensive highways and bridges and fences and security and cameras and high tech and guard salaries and such like. So that it seems to me that's a challenge that maybe university institutions on the two sides would want to cooperate on and find some mutual benefit. And the final practical proposal I wanted to make, or possibility I wanted to raise, is one that has seemed to me more and more plausible the more I think about it. When we first arrived from the airport in El Paso and across the border, we went by the International Peace Guard, which I think is the right name for it, International Peace something, Garden, Park, I guess. Yes?
A park.
It is a park. There is a similar, there's at least one similar one between Canada and the United States at the end of a major highway. And it has a binational commission that has jurisdiction over it. It is all green, so that I assume that whatever the arrangements for the supply of irrigation of water is, it's been agreed that it should be kept green. And it is intended as a symbol, that's its name, of peace between the two countries. It's got a fence now. And it blows your mind to have an international peace garden with a fence down the middle. And what better symbol could there be of how unpeaceful the world is than the fact that you can't even have a garden that people could use from both sides. And perhaps Planners Network, or perhaps a group of students, or perhaps some graffiti experts, or others concerned could play with the idea of what that peace garden might be. Suppose it were developed as an international center of solidarity. Suppose that it had buildings that would house conferences, that would put on exhibitions, that would put on performances, that would have art within maybe a fence around it, but no fence in it, where people could come in from both sides freely, no questions asked. Perhaps a question would be asked, if you want to leave, if you want to go, you should go back to the country you came from. But at least within the park, there is no border. People work together, and it's intended to support people working together. wouldn't that be a project that that's feasible? That people might really spend some time on usefully, and then put some pressure on the binational commission that runs it, and some pressure on the Congress of the U.S. and the national government of Mexico to extend their support and to finance some actions of solidarity within its boundaries. I think there are many things like this that could be done. And I'll finish with that. I think there are many things like that could be done with cross-border cooperation. And I hope Planners Network will play a role in this, and I hope that all of you and I can play some role in making this happen. It seems to me badly needed. It seems to me this conference is a real step forward in bringing something like that about, and I wish it future success.